Today on Uncommon Sense, I will speak with Joseph Pearce, author and editor of the St. Austin Review, and a speaker at the 42nd Annual Chesterton Conference this summer. Stay tuned to hear more. Hello and welcome to Uncommon Sense, the official podcast of the Society of Gilbert Keith Chesterton. As I mentioned, I'm here with our dear friend Joseph Pearce. Joseph, it's good to talk to you today.
It's good to be back with you.
Yeah, and as always, I'm Grettelyn, your host. So today we're mostly going to be we've spoken with Joseph a few times. He's helped us with Tolkien and several other great authors, but we definitely want to talk today about your talk at the conference this year, Joseph. But first, would you like to say anything about yourself for our listeners who may not have heard you before?
Well, my name is Joseph Pearce. I'm the author of a number of books, including a biography of G.K. Chesterton, which would be obviously relevant to this particular podcast. I also have my own personal website, so if anybody wants to keep up with what I'm up to, I post 3 new podcasts every week there and write an original essay, and there's also anything else I'm doing is on there, and that's jpearce.co, so jpearce.co.
And we'll have that in the notes for the podcast. So don't worry if you can't understand the accent. No, I think it's perfectly clear. But anyway, so yeah, feel free to follow Joseph and find out more. He's a fascinating speaker, and I'm sure many of you are looking forward to hearing him at the conference. So this year, we've heard your conversion story a few times at the conference, but I don't know, is this the first time you're talking about the Middle Ages at the conference?
Yes, probably. I mean, I went to my first conference back in, I think, 2002, and I've only missed a handful since then. So I'm a regular feature at the conference. It's one of the highlights of the year for me. So I do encourage people, if you haven't signed up, to do so, because you'll have a great time. So obviously, over the years, I've spoken on all sorts of topics at one time or another. So I can't honestly remember what I've spoken on. But as far as I'm aware, I haven't spoken. I don't normally give talks on history, except perhaps or Shakespeare, Tudor England possibly, and the 19th and 20th century Catholic literary revival. I'm sure I've spoken on those before. But going further back than the age of Shakespeare, the 16th century, I'm sure I haven't spoken anything that far back thus far at a conference. So this is new ground for me.
Well, that'll be exciting. I know I'm looking forward to it. So give us, a couple of highlights. I know St. Francis is obviously going to be in there because that's the theme of our conference. But how is, what's the main thrust of the talk?
Yeah, so when I heard that the theme of this year's conference would be St. Francis of Assisi to celebrate the centenary of Chesterton's wonderful biography of St. Francis, I wondered what I had up my sleeve that would be good to fit somehow with the theme. And as luck or providence would have it, I've actually finished writing last year. I wrote a book which will be published later this year. Alas, I doubt very much in time for the conference, called The Good, the Bad, and the Beautiful, a history of Christendom in 3 dimensions. So it contains one chapter on every century from the time of Christ to the 20th century. So, and each one, the 3 dimensions is that in every century there's the good, mostly the saints, but not exclusively, the bad, which is both the Caesar, the power of secularism and its war upon Christendom, and also the Judas Iscariot, the enemies and heretics within the church, and then the beautiful. So every century is also producing great art, literature, visual art, music, etc. So the book was inspired by a quote by the late wonderful Pope Benedict XVI. I almost said Saint Benedict XVI. He is a saint as far as I'm concerned. He said, ultimately, the only defense for the Catholic Church are the saints she's produced and the great works of beauty that she's inspired. So this idea of the church ultimately being about goodness and beauty, obviously the truth of the faith, But you have against that this theme of wickedness, of secularism, relativism, etc., that runs through history. So that's the three dimensions. So obviously, I've done a chapter on every century. So I thought what I could do. I can't remember the exact title I've given, but I think it's instead of the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, sort of Gibbon's famous book. I think it's the fall and rise of the Roman Empire, and the idea being as Chesterton says, to blame the Catholic Church for wanting to take us back to the Dark Ages is absurd, as the Catholic Church was the only thing that brought us out of the Dark Ages, and was in fact a bridge from the fall of the Roman Empire to the rise of the High Middle Ages. So what I'll be doing is talking about that period from the fall of the Roman Empire to the High Middle Ages, culminating, if you like, with St. Francis, St. Dominic, and immediately after that, St. Thomas Aquinas, etc. So that will be the theme of my talk.
Sounds great. Sounds really great. Sort of, there's still this lingering feeling of the Dark Ages, which we talked before is there was no such thing, at least not in the time period that it's attributed to. But it's always fun to hear another debunking of that silly theory.
Yeah, and I will follow the theme. I do. So it will be obviously the darkness of the so-called Dark Ages, and there was certainly a lot of darkness around at the time, which is true of all centuries, not just the so-called Dark Ages. But obviously, even in the age of the collapse of the Roman Empire and the sort of anarchy which ensued, the church was a force to be reckoned with, and in fact, seeds of renewal will be implanted by, for instance, Saint Benedict from the earliest times, the rise of monasticism. So that was the light in the darkness, if you like, that carried us through that darkness into the High Middle Ages, which was the fruit of that revival in the wake of the Roman Empire.
Beautiful. And people forget that it was the monks oftentimes that copied the text that we now have from the ancient world, sort of saved all that for us. Excuse me. So it's nice to be reminded of sometimes who we have to thank for all of that. But tell me a little more about how this is going to tie in with Saint Francis. Are you going to have any specific theme there?
Well, I don't intend the main part of my talk to be on St. Francis, because I'm guessing other people will be doing that, and we don't want to be just repeating the same thing over and over again. But what I will be doing is giving what lays the foundations for the High Middle Ages, of which St. Francis is a fruit. Although, of course, St. Francis, like St. Benedict, is also a pioneer. The other thing about the great saints is they don't just carry on the tradition, and they do, but they also renew the culture. And in the case of both St. Francis and St. Dominic, of course, that's exactly what they did do at a time whenever the church appears to be becoming, shall we say, decadent or corrupt, God always sends these marvelous saints to save the day, like superheroes. And that's basically what we see. So, my narrative will say, okay, fall of the Roman Empire, collapse, anarchy, but out of the anarchy we have the rise of monasticism, and then we have various periods of renewal and desolation, decadence, and except one of those ends of one of those periods of renewal. We have the Cistercians, for instance, another great time of renewal between the Benedictines and the Franciscans and Dominicans. So you have these times of renewal, and then this time of decadence, and then that's where we're at, basically. When St. Francis comes on the scene, the church is in a bit of a mess, to say the least. And again, the other thing I'm very keen on, and I keep reiterating, is when we say the church, we have to have two things in mind here, always. We have to have the transcendent reality of the church. The church is the mystical body of Jesus Christ. We have to understand the vast bulk of the church in terms of the numbers of saints and angels is in the church triumphant, which is already outside of the long defeat of history, as Tolkien would call it. And that's already where the victory is. And each of us in our own lifetime just has to be faithful soldiers in the church militant, the church at war with the wickedness of the world, in order to cross the finishing line into the church triumphant. So we have to bear that in mind. When I say the church, that always has to be in our mind. But when I say the church in the other sense, in the church militant, the church at war within time. There are people who are victims. They fall. They might fall as martyrs and cross the finishing line. They might fall as traitors and for all we know, go to hell. Not that I want to judge where anybody goes. So this is a war. So basically, St. Francis comes along at a time when it appeared that the forces of darkness, the forces of wickedness, the forces of secularism from outside the church, the forces of corruption from inside the church, if you like, attacking the church militant like a pincer movement, very dangerous pincer movement from without and from within. But whenever this happens, God always sends, as I say, superheroes, great saints, and St. Francis and St. Dominic, both being sent at the same time, renewed the church with the mendicant orders, then spread across the world in the centuries that followed.
Yeah, and it's funny because if you know anything about St. Francis, you know that by the time he was like on his deathbed, his order was already starting to be corrupt. And he was, trying to call them back, but it's you might look at that and say, "Oh man is so weak. Look how short a time it takes for us to get corrupt in such a beautiful thing." But that just means God gets to send us more superheroes, right? So
exactly, that's what he does whenever we need it, in various ways. I mean, it was 3 centuries after St. Francis. We have St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross. The Carmelite order is becoming weak and corrupt, and they renew the order from within. And St. John of the Cross is imprisoned by his own superior. And scourged and left in solitary confinement for all we know forever until he'd rotted. He wasn't released; he escaped. So we see that the God sends great saints to renew a church, to prevent the natural process in a fallen cosmos. Is what you might call spiritual entropy. I do see the physical cosmos and the physical laws of the cosmos, of physics, if you like, of reflecting the metaphysical laws, the spiritual laws. So entropy, the part of the natural decaying process of everything within the physical cosmos is a reflection of spiritual entropy, that without the input and infusion of grace, in other words, supernatural energy from outside, we invariably and inevitably corrupt. And that's what God does with his church. He gives us that energy from without with these great saints at the time that the church needs it most, to prevent that corruption from taking over. In actual fact, to continue to renew the church, with his grace.
Beautiful. And it's amazing how he does it in microcosm and in macro, because St. Francis himself, was sort of pursuing all the wrong things, and then he had his conversion. You mentioned St. Teresa of Avila. She was one of my favorites. And she famously, entered the Carmelites because she thought it would be a nice, cushy life and a nice, easy way to live. So God kind of shines into the personal life of a human being, shows them the right path, and if they accept, then they kind of by default enter into the salvation of the greater church. It's really
absolutely neat. And we have to realize that sanctity, which is actually ultimately synonymous with sanity. Sin is ultimately synonymous with insanity, with madness. Turning your back on God is the craziest thing anybody can do. But we have to understand that sanctity, is inseparable from the cross. Now, we talked about the suffering of St. John of the Cross, the suffering of St. Teresa of Avila, which is voluntary suffering. With St. Francis of Assisi, he has in some he accepts it, but he has, if you like, involuntary suffering, because God there's a visitation which leads to the stigmata, right, where he's actually got the wounds of Christ, which is given to him as a gift, all right. And so this shows us that we have to accept the cross of Christ and the suffering of Christ in our own sufferings, with not just acceptance. I mean, that's the minimum. There's no progress in spiritual life unless we learn to accept suffering. But ultimately, if we're going to grow beyond that into sanctity, we need to embrace suffering. In other words, see it as a gift and not merely accept it, perhaps grudgingly, but to actually embrace it as the cross that we need to carry. And of course, ask for the help of our neighbors and, most important, God Himself to help us carry our cross, because none of us can do it unassisted. And that's the glory of it. Suffering forces us to love the Lord thy God and to love our neighbor, and they're the two great commandments.
Beautiful, beautiful. I've been learning a lot about suffering. Thankfully, not too much from personal experience, but just trying to make sense of some personal experience. But through the testimonies of a lot of other people, there's a lot of sort of, sorry, this is a tangent, but let's go there for real quick. Just to understand that suffering is not even something to hide. It's a part of us. It's something that God has given us to make us more whole. So it's sort of this beautiful, and to maybe try to tie it back, because we are kind of going on a tangent, but I love it. Again, in history, sort of, you have these periods of suffering. That the Roman Empire falls. That's got to be really hard for the people living at that time. Think about all of our infrastructure now just going away suddenly, very quickly. And suddenly life is much, much harder. But it sort of forges the world into a more beautiful state of Christianity that probably maybe wouldn't have happened if the Roman Empire had just gone on and on and on.
Yes, exactly. That we have to understand that comfort tends to be a great corrupter. But even comfort does not protect us from suffering. In fact, some of the great works of literature, particularly by, for instance, the French decadents such as Georges Huysmans, shows us that if we, he said something in one of his novels. If you can go off on a tangent, so can I. It shows in one of the novels what happens if someone has no attachments and he's incredibly wealthy, so no responsibilities and enough money to do exactly what he wants. And that's what in Huysman's novel Arabura, that's exactly what happens. This person is completely free to indulge every single sensual desire that he has, and at the end of it, he's crying. It's a cri de coeur from to a God he doesn't even know exists, begging help from the despair he finds himself in. Because this is the whole point, and brings us back to St. Francis, because this is the core of what St. Francis teaches in his life. St. Dominic and Thomas Aquinas are teachers in the sense of didacticism. St. Francis of Assisi teaches just because of who he is and what he did, right? But what we discover is that we're all going to suffer, that there's no escape from suffering. And the irony, and perhaps the paradox, as we're talking in a Chestertonian context, is that those who spend most time and effort trying to escape from suffering are the ones who suffer most. Ultimately, those who embrace their cross and ask for help to carry it are much happier than those who spend their lives trying to escape the cross, because they still end up with it. And the difference is that they don't know what to do with their suffering. They resent it, they hate it, they blame everybody for it. And so I always say, that basically everybody is crucified with Christ on Golgotha. It's just whether we are the good thief or the bad thief. Do we accept our suffering as a consequence of our sin and the sins of others? Or do we hate our suffering and blame everybody, God and neighbor, for the fact that we're in a miserable situation? So suffering is unavoidable. It's not a question of trying to avoid suffering, because we can't. It's what we do with it that matters.
Right. It's the difference between Brideshead Revisited or The Great Gatsby.
Great, I love that. You should write about that sometime.
And I will, yeah. As soon as I have time. Yeah, I'll keep it in here, and we'll see. No, that's great. So I'm going to take a minute and give a little commercial break, and then we'll see if we can get back on track. But I just want to say, for all of you listening, this was a preview of an afterglow that we just gave you. It was maybe not super on topic, but how fun and how awesome to just dive into to literature with you, Joseph. Thank you.
My pleasure.
So if you want to do this more, if you want to come and do this in person, come meet Joseph Pearce and hear his talk. you can. The conference is in Minneapolis this summer. Feel free to visit chesterton.org/conference to learn more about how you can register and come and join us. Again, if you want to learn more about Joseph himself and hear his podcast, jpearce.co. That's jpearce.co. And again, we'll post both of those links in the notes so that you can find out more. But anyway, let's try to get back on topic. And tell me this then. So we have the Middle Ages, we have the saints, the church. Where is Chesterton in this talk?
Well, I will obviously be quoting from bit like Dale Ahlquist. I find it difficult to write or speak without referencing Chesterton somewhere or other, because he says so much which is so brilliant on so many different things that really, on whatever you're talking, Chesterton probably says something that's relevant to it. So obviously, when you're talking about the past, I'll be quoting from Chesterton's Orthodoxy, obviously his book on St. Francis of Assisi, from the Everlasting Man. So my book, when it's published, as always, has lots of quotes from Chesterton that are relevant to whatever period of history I'm happen to be writing about. Chesterton can speak about the time of Christ, he can speak about the 20th century, and he can speak about any century in between. So obviously, I'll be covering about 5 centuries and maybe 6 centuries, and Chesterton will feature with appropriate prominence.
Truly a Catholic mind. Truly a Catholic mind. Wonderful. What else can you tell us about the talk? I don't want to totally spoil it, but any other highlights you want to share?
Well, needless to say, anybody who's heard me speak knows that I hardly ever, almost never, speak by reading what I've written. I turn up with fairly scanty bullet points and allow the muse and to lead me. So of course I haven't written the talk. At some point I shall sit down and revisit the 6 or so chapters that cover the period from the fall of the Roman Empire to the time of St. Francis. And we'll take bullet pointed notes, which will be the basis of my talk. So, it's difficult for me to tell you exactly what's going to be in my talk when I haven't actually given it too much thought yet. The thing is that, that with me, I've got so many multifarious things that I do, writing, editing, speaking, traveling, teaching, both in situ at places and online, that it's like I liken it metaphorically to a juggler. That you've got, quite a number of balls in the air, and the only one you can worry about is the next one coming down, so you don't drop it. The ones in the air you don't worry about till then the next one coming down. So I've got things to do this week, but I'm traveling this Saturday to film a couple of courses. So I've been preparing those today. So whenever the next deadline is, that's hanging like a sword of Damocles over my head, that's the one that gets my attention. The Chesterton Conference, I'm really looking forward to it, but it's sufficiently so far in the distance that it's not particularly on my radar. So you're not going to get details, minutiae of my talk beyond those broad parameters we've discussed, because I haven't thought about it to any great degree beyond what we've just said.
But you brought in the Juggler of God, which is the subtitle of the conference. So great job.
That was providential. I'm not smart enough to have done that on purpose, but you're smart enough to have pointed it out. So well done, Grettelyn.
I just do my job. But no, that's great. And I'm sure, I found in my own life that the more you do, sort of, the more you're able to do. One creative aspect kind of helps with another. So that's great. And, you talk about things, you work on something, and it actually informs something else.
Yeah, the key element, I think, and I've got better at it through practice over the years, is time management. I'm just very good at time management. I look at the day and look at what's happening in the next 6 or 7 days and work out how I have to prioritize to make sure that I'm ready for whatever I have to be ready for. Of course, that does mean that things you don't have to be ready do get put on the back burner. That's inevitable, and that's the way things are. If you've got more on your plate than you can handle, you just have to prioritize and make sure that the things you have to do get done.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's great. Well, let's just quickly, we have a few more minutes, and I'd love to just delve into your new book a little bit. Even if it's not ready by the conference, people can go to your website and find out more. But it sounds like almost like a very Bellockian kind of endeavor. He wrote some of those bigger, sort of all-encompassing histories. Did you have Belloc in mind at all? Was this sort of a planned project, or did it kind of just happen?
No, obviously, I'm very influenced by Belloc, especially in my historical understanding, as I'm influenced by Chesterton. But as I said earlier, it was largely this quote by Saint Pope Benedict XVI that was the launching pad, the catalyst for my imagination. And what came to me was that many of us fall into the trap of becoming progressives. Let me explain that, because most people who are coming to the Chesterton Conference will not call themselves progressives. But let me explain what progressivism is. Progressivism is the idea that history is a progress from a past to a future. Now, if you think this progress is good, then the future is always better than the present, and the present's better than the past. The past, all of the past to one degree or the other, not just the Dark Ages, but everything is the Dark Ages, right? The past is primitive. It's shackled by superstition and religion. We have to get rid of all of that so we can move forward and liberate ourselves from all of those things and become happy, right? That's progressivism. Now, most people that come to the Chesterton Conference, I would maybe venture to say almost all people that come to the Chesterton Conference do not buy into that meta-narrative of time and history. But many of us do so subconsciously because we basically agree with all of that. It's just we don't like it, all right? So we basically accept progressivism as an inevitability, which is what they want us to believe, and we don't like it. And of course, that, if we're not careful, is a prerequisite for despair, right? Which is the final defeat of us personally. So what I wanted to show was, far from that being how history it actually works out. History is always human, right? So what that means that there are three aspects of who we are as human beings. We're Homo viator, man on the journey, the appointed journey being to heaven. Homo superbus, proud man who refuses the journey. And Anthropos, he who looks up in wonder, sees the stars, and is inspired by God's creation to be creative himself and produce works of beauty as the imago Dei, the imagination. So history is the good of Homo viator, the bad of Homo superbus, and the beautiful of Anthropos, the three aspects of who we are as human beings. That's what manifests history. So history should be seen as a three-dimensional tapestry with these three threads weaving their way through each century, rather than something which is an ascent or a descent. It's a pattern.
I love that. And, obviously I agree about, I think I just was a progressive because that's what everybody is. That's what you're taught, like from birth, pretty much, is that like we're better than everyone who came before. And it sort of took a long, long time to get your head around, well, they did make Notre Dame with no computers. So like there were points in history where people were doing astounding things with less than what we have today. And it sort of becomes you sort of notice eventually that there's just different focus too. Like in different times in history, I think people just focus on different things.
Yeah, I mean, we can argue. I mean, for instance, in terms of literature, which is my thing, the greatest works of literature, the absolute greatest works of literature are the Iliad and the Odyssey, which were written before the time of Christ, the Aeneid, written before the time of Christ, Dante's Divine Comedy, and the works of Shakespeare. There's nothing since then that equals that. So the whole idea that we're on an ascent in terms of what we're capable of doing in terms of literary beauty is clearly nonsense. Now, there was a golden age in the 19th century of the novel, and so that it's an ongoing, living tradition, which is wonderful. Again, music. You could argue that the golden age maybe was the time of classical music or romanticism, but even then, you're talking about the 18th and 19th century. Not in and so no one's going to really suggest that music has been getting better in terms of beauty since then. So and the same thing with art, right? Whether you think the greatest art belongs to the Middle Ages or the Renaissance or to the 19th century, if you like, Impressionism, whatever. Nobody's going to suggest that the 20th century was a golden age of art. So it's quite clear that the only thing that we can claim progress for is technology. Right, we're becoming more clever, And as any person knows, there's a huge difference, an abysmal difference, the abyss that separates heaven and hell between wisdom and cleverness. Cleverness is just the ability to do things, and you can, if you're motivated by pride and not humility, that cleverness will be put to the use of wickedness and the devil. So the invention of nuclear bombs, for instance, right? It's very clever, but is it wise? So that's the whole thing I'm trying to sort of convey. And I should say one thing, returning to Chesterton, I got this idea initially from Chesterton, in The Everlasting Man, in particularly in the first chapter, that the man in the cave, he shows the chronological snobbery of the 20th century in looking down its supercilious nose at the past. And he says, we go in the cave, we don't find any evidence of barbarism. What we find on the walls is art. So in other words, what we find is, and he calls it art, he says, art is the signature of man. We find our own signature on the walls of the cave.
And it's really beautiful. I mean, if you've seen some of the ancient artwork in France and some of the other places, it's lovely. It's proportionate. It's expressive. It's not, it's not the primitive scratchings that you might think of. It's real art.
Well, I'm not going to pick up my computer and unplug it and take it to another part of my office here, but I do actually have a cave painting of a rhinoceros, on the wall of my office as a reminder of that chapter from Chesterton, the man in the cave, how Chesterton taught me not to be a chronological snob. And C.S. Lewis, whose own conversion was largely due to reading The Everlasting Man, it was he, I believe, who coined the phrase chronological snobbery. But that was an idea he got from Chesterton. I'm sure Chesterton got it from other people too. We're all part of a living legacy. But certainly for me, that this book would not be possible if I hadn't had this understanding of history that I received from Chesterton, especially in books such as The Everlasting Man.
Wonderful. Well, I'm looking forward to reading it. Thanks for sharing. Well, we are almost out of time here, but if there's anything else you want to say about the conference, about the talk, about anything at all, now's your chance.
Well, the only thing I would say is that, I travel a great deal, more than I would like. And the Chesterton Conference is every year a highlight of my year. It's a red letter day on the calendar, shall we say. And it's, I'm quite happy to miss many things and stay at home with my wife and children. But Susanna, my wonderful wife, knows how much I enjoy the Chesterton Conference. And if I showed any indication of thinking I should stay at home because I've been traveling a great deal, she'd probably push me out the door because she knows it's important for me to go there. So if anybody hasn't been to the Chesterton Conference, I do urge you to sign up. Those who have been already know what I'm talking about. There's the great talks, but you mentioned the afterglow. It's the conviviality of the place, where you can talk on any topic to like-minded people, make new friends, and enjoy some good fermented and distilled beverages while you're at it.
Mm-hmm. And this year we're going to have some cigar specialists too, so that should be
there we are. It gets better and better.
Yeah, extra fun. No, it's wonderful, and you always learn something new. I don't care how learned you are, you always learn something new, and it's just so much fun. So please go to chesterton.org/conference. Check it out today. I think you will not regret it if you decide to come. Well, thank you so much, Joseph. This has been really, really wonderful. I wish we could have had like a couple of hours to go on all those tangents.
Well, we win at the conference.
Yes, there you go. So thank you though. And everyone listening, remember to check out Joseph's website also, jpearce.co, to learn more about him and his talks and his podcast. Please don't forget for us to like and subscribe, share this video, help us reach more people with the wit and wisdom of Chesterton, and to tell the world that Chesterton is always better with friends. Thank you so much, and we'll talk to you next time.